Good afternoon, Masa al-Khair, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. It's a very special day for us at AUC, not only for our distinguished guests who are joining us here in the panel, but for all of our distinguished members of the audience. I would like to mention also that we have standing room only. In fact, we have an overflow audience. We have people in Ewart Hall. We are aware of you, and you are participating with us as well. Perhaps afterwards, if the ambassadors have time, there may be a chance to mingle out in the courtyard. I will mention one housekeeping note too, actually. One, as usual, if you have mobile phones, please silence them. But the other is there will be an opportunity for questions after we have some opening remarks and Ms. Hadidi conducts the conversation. We will have question cards circulated here and in Ewart Hall, so that those at the overflow can participate. You can kindly note your questions. We will collect them and make sure that our panelists are able to have them. It's truly a special day. AUC's mission, our role as Egypt's global university, is to bring Egypt to the world and the world to Egypt, especially to bring Americans and Egyptians together. In this case, we're bringing back together Americans who know Egypt, who love Egypt. There are, in fact, 4 of us present today, 3 former career professional Foreign Service officers who dreamed to come here, and a currently serving career professional from the region who dreamed of coming here. So all of us realized our dreams in coming and serving at one of the United States' most important overseas embassies to a pivotally important country, a warmly inviting country to Americans and to all others. So that has been the achievement of a dream for all of us. It's unusual to have the 4 of us together today. It's also unusual to have us with one of our most esteemed and world-renowned alumni conducting the conversation. I'll say just a note about each. Jonathan Cohen, Ambassador of the United States, welcome to Cairo. We wish you a spectacularly successful and warm and wonderful experience as each of the 3 of us had here among these wonderful people of Egypt. We have trustees of our university also among us today. We have so many old friends. In order to give more time to our speakers, I will not call the names of everybody in the room because that's not why we're here. But I see so many old friends and faces here. I look forward to seeing you perhaps after. Let me mention Frank Wisner, of course, who was serving here as the ambassador when I arrived as a young diplomat. I learned the trade from him here in Egypt. He shared with me his love of Egypt, his knowledge of Egypt, his excitement and his way of engaging with the Egyptian people, as well as the government, the business sector, the media, all well represented here today, and of course with AUC. He served as an American ambassador in many countries, but he and I speak a lot in Egypt, really has emerged as a favorite for both of us. Dan Kurtzer, also a longtime friend and colleague, served not only in Egypt, but also in Israel. There aren't many of us who have served in both places and have the particular 360-degree perspective on one of the region's most enduring complex of issues. So we're delighted that Dan is able to come with us today. I should emphasize that both gentlemen, like myself, are private American citizens, speak only for ourselves. Frank Wisner is privately consulting as an international advisor with Squire, Patton, Boggs in New York. And Dan Kurtzer is with Princeton University and is now teaching and has generations of students who have learned about the Middle East from him. And finally, I will come back to our great alumna, Lamis Al-Hadidi, probably Egypt's most well-known television interviewer who has been with so many channels. If I mention all those, it would be easier to mention the ones you haven't served on. We're particularly thrilled that our alumna has come back to conduct this conversation today. We've all warned Ambassador Cohen that it's fine to present your credentials, it's important to do that, but you're only really established as the U.S. ambassador here after Lamis has officially interviewed you. So prepare very well. Very well.
Very important introduction.
she is very nice, but she gets right to the point and she asks all the difficult questions. We're counting on everyone to be very candid today. We do have the news media here, so this is on the record. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, and to all for coming. Have a great conversation.
Thank you, Ambassador. I don't know if I should do this standing up or sitting, but let me start. I'm a bit short anyway. I'm very honored to be here back at AUC. It's always very nostalgic for me to be back at my hometown. This is my university. This is where all the dreams started coming true. This is where all my professors taught me how to write a news article, how to be an anchor. This is where all it started. And all the rooms, all the walls, everywhere is very special to me. I'm also very honored to be among a great crowd of old friends, and my only annoying thing, Ambassador, is that you're writing the dates of my graduation and my master's. And I thought we should not be doing this with women. We should not be writing that everybody will know how old I am now. Anyway. I'm also very honored to be with 4 esteemed ambassadors to Egypt. Ambassador Kurtzer, Ambassador Wisner, the new ambassador, of course, our friend Ambassador Richard Doney. I was just telling the ambassador that he should take the new ambassador around. Tanta, you should take him around and not only to the embassy. Let me start. I think I should be sitting now. Is this where I'm going? Oh, okay. So I don't need the mic. Okay. So thank you for accepting, all of us. Thank you for being here, and I'm very happy again to be with Ambassador Kurtzer, Ambassador Wisner. Ambassador Wisner has been serving in Egypt from 86 to 91. Ambassador Kurtzer has been serving in Egypt from 98 to 2001. And that's not a very long time. I mean, things have changed. I will ask you about your impressions later, but I need to know your impression first about what happened yesterday. I will start being a journalist, and I will ask you, what was your impression? How did you react to the small demonstration that the students took yesterday against American foreign policy towards the Palestinian issue? Ambassador Kurtzer.
Well, first of all, is this on? It's working? Yes. First of all, it's great to be back in Egypt. And it's wonderful to be back at AUC. Yesterday we were at the new campus, and today to see this beautiful job that's been done in updating this campus is really wonderful. The best part, however, is to meet, I don't want to call you old friends, but friends of long standing. And it's really great. That's what makes coming back to Egypt so special. Yesterday, Ambassador Wisner and I did this same kind of interview conversation with students and faculty, and almost at the beginning, a fairly large group of students stood up, shouted slogans, held up signs that said "Free Palestine," and walked out. And on the one hand, as I mentioned later on in the event, it was quite a nice gesture, because demonstrations are a manifestation of free speech and free association. And the fact that the students were expressing their views about Palestine, about the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, about American policy by extension, was a positive thing. But as I also noted, it was curious that after demonstrating, they didn't stay to engage in dialogue. Because after all, I recall learning that Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State under John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, once said that the real tools of a diplomat are his or her ears. In other words, it's important not just to speak your government's policy, but also to be listening to what others say. And it would have been a much better event for all of us had all of those students or some of those students stayed behind and asked tough questions or expressed a tough view that it would allow Ambassador Wisner and me to respond. And I think they would have been a bit surprised to hear that some of us are a little bit critical of our own government's policy with respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the so-called peace process. But not having been there, they've now gone away. They're happy that they had this demonstration, but they really don't understand anything more than what they came and demonstrated. And I think that was a lost opportunity for them.
Ambassador Wisner, would you like to comment on yesterday's incident?
No, I think Dan said everything that I could have possibly imagined. Perhaps just to add a point that I believe he and I both share, and that is an enormous sense of frustration over the course of our careers as ambassadors, struggling with this issue that has been so central to the life of the region. To look at the plight of the people of Palestine, to look at the situation Israel faces, and to realize after years of effort, this is not resolved and is nowhere near being resolved. That remains a daunting fact and a real sense of loss for all of us who engaged in it. So I had a lot of sentiment for the young people who spoke out yesterday. But again, I think Dan put his finger on it. Expressing frustration is one thing, but trying to find a path through a very dark passage, a very dark forest, is much more difficult and requires listening and learning, not just expressing.
We will talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, later in the panel. But let me start by asking you a question. When we were talking before we come here, I said that here at the American University in Cairo, I was taught when we were being taught political science that the American political institution is made of institutions. The American political system is made of institutions, and the checks and balances. And there is a long way to take any decree. What we're witnessing now is totally the reverse, is totally the opposite. We cannot read what's in the mind of Washington. We cannot read what is happening. We cannot read what decision will be taken. And I don't know if Americans themselves can read Washington or can predict what is happening in Washington. What is happening in the American political system?
I would offer two comments. Number one, the only constant in the study of American history is the process of change. Richard Hofstadter, one of our great historians, said that every 20 years America goes through a kind of revolution of thinking or economy or society. We're in the midst of that now, and it happens to be quite a profound and quite important period of change, largely defined by a degree of partisanship in our politics that's always been there to some extent, but is now more pronounced, where if one party says A, the other party feels compelled to say Z, and vice versa, where people have stopped thinking about the issues under consideration if they are proposed or legislated by the other party. Ambassador Wisner and I were talking this morning about one of the great ironies, for example, of what was called Obamacare, the health care reforms that were adopted some years ago. The states that benefited the most from Obamacare were so-called red states. They were states which voted Republican. And yet the Republicans took it upon themselves as a matter of principle to undo Obamacare because Obama had been the author of the program. Now, it didn't mean that Obamacare was perfect. No legislation is perfect. But the idea that one party had to oppose it simply because the president of the other party had initiated it tells you something about the depth of the partisan divide. The second comment I'd make is we have never had a president like the current president who has been as divisive a figure, and I don't mean just on policy, I also mean on personality. There are many people who can agree or disagree with a president's policies. Both Ambassador Wisner and I, Ambassador Ricciardoni and Ambassador Cohen, have served under Republican and Democrat administrations, and our job has been to carry out the policies of the administration, even if we have the privilege of arguing for different policies while we're within the government. It's very hard to imagine serving now in an administration which is so unsteady, and in which a president seems to lavish praise on the dictators and has found a way to distance himself from our allies, in which a president is so unpredictable in domestic policy terms, whether it's on immigration or on health care or on taxation, and as well as a president whose personal life has been a subject of much criticism for so many reasons. And that adds a dimension to what I call this partisan divide, because it's not just a question of change of policy. There's something else going on in the United States which is very hard to put our finger on, and something that we hope can right itself in the couple of years ahead.
Ambassador Wisner, within that polarization and so the unpredictability of the political system within the United States now, how do you see the foreign policy?
Well, let me just add a word to what Dan said, because I think what Dan's underscored is what lies before us, but we can all sympathize with your sense of frustration, confusion over what's going on in the United States. And I think if you take a step back, and why this time in our lives is so terribly serious for all Americans, is that, frankly, we're in the midst of something we've never had happen before, and that is both a constitutional crisis and an election. We're about to have the election next year. The campaign is already in full swing. The constitutional crisis is taking the form of an impeachment, which is a very rare phenomena in American politics, and draws on the Constitution in its deepest meaning, in which the president has chosen to defy the normal institutions of the country and refuse to cooperate with the legislative branch. That remains to be worked out. And we're watching, therefore, a struggle for where the presidency and its authorities and power and the balances written into the Constitution are going to play out. We don't know yet. At the same time, we're going to be deciding who should be the president at the polls. Now, I don't know how the impeachment matter will play out. I tend to think that the president will be impeached.
Will be impeached.
Will be impeached.
Impeached reaching a resignation, or will be impeached?
No, let me explain it.
If you can explain to the people what is the impeachment.
Let me see if I can explain. Impeachment in the American, in the use of the word in the United States in our Constitution, is the conclusion by one House of Congress, the House of Representatives, that as prosecutor, they are putting the president on trial. The trial itself takes place in the Senate, with the senators acting, as you will, as jurors, presided over not by the vice president who normally presides over the Senate, but by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's very unusual. So impeachment really means an indictment. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean a successful conclusion of a trial, nor the demission of office.
And after the indictment?
Sorry?
After the indictment, what is the
The indictment
process?
is impeachment.
Okay.
And if the House completes this, which I think it will, by the end of the year, that's the current expectation, then the matter will be referred to the Senate. And the Senate will then sit in judgment and reach a conclusion. That conclusion will be guilty, not guilty, and we'll see how it comes out. I tend to think at this point it's pretty difficult given the fact that 2/3 of the Senate must pass in favor of the dethronement, if you will, of a president, that it's really, really difficult to achieve that kind of majority since the Republicans
Yes.
have a majority in that. But then we're cast immediately into an election. And anyone who tells any of you in this room how the American election is going to end up, I would ask you to look at them square in the eye and say, let's wait and see, because there are massive uncertainties. Donald Trump was elected by a very slim majority in a limited number of states, and much has happened in this presidency. The Democrats don't have a candidate yet, so it's really up for grabs. I say that because to understand what we're going through, this dual crisis, the concept of having to face two things at once is really one of the most difficult political moments in my life. Now, to your
Moving
question,
to the, yes,
what
the, to
happens to
foreign
American
policy.
foreign policy during this time? Well, I won't argue that it's a healthy environment for the elaboration of American foreign policy, but then, as Dan noted, during the course of the Trump administration, the normal processes of defining foreign policy, of comparing interests of different ministries, different elements of our government, and passing those up through and to the National Security Council, to the President for decision, those normal processes of cogitation, of consideration have been set aside. And we find a foreign policy more often than not that is done on the fly by the President in a tweet or in a statement or a loose remark. So many of the critically important policies have been policies that have been defined outside. That's not going to change. And on top of it, we're going to be in an election period, and there will be less focus on the orderly prosecution and elaboration of foreign policy. For the next year, foreign policy will take a backseat to American domestic politics. In the end, we'll have to see who comes out. But I think I would leave you with the following thought, that we are reaching a moment in American foreign policy that is enormously important. I would argue that whether you're speaking for Donald Trump or his Democratic adversaries, that there is a deep sense of preoccupation about where America is in the world. That the United States has, over the past decades, spent its influence, its reputation, its resources in the prosecution of wars in distant lands, Iraq and Afghanistan notably, and with very little result, dispiriting our country, leaving people with questions about the quality of our leadership. As a result, two basic schools are emerging. One the President represents, and that is, let's pull back from unnecessary engagements defined as engagements not in the direct national interest. And we will put America first, and we will obey those rules on the global forum that are convenient to us, and we will operate inside of treaties and agreements where it is clearly beneficial to the American interest. On the other side, there is an agreement that we should no longer be reaching as far forward as we did in the 1990s and 2000s. Instead, on the Democratic side, more accurately described, but many Republicans as well, would argue that the United States' best interests are served by being a global citizen, by dealing with the rules of the international order, by the treaties we've designed, the policies we've pursued over many decades, many of which need to be updated and changed. So those two basic points mean in both cases, the United States will not in the future be acting as you have seen it act in the past 20 years. There will be a definite change in the style and direction of policy. And I believe that will help begin to clarify where we're going to be in several years, but getting there is going to be very complex.
Ambassador Kurtzer, if we move back, I will stay a little bit with the American elections before moving to the region. How do you see this forthcoming with all the uncertainties that Ambassador Wisner is talking about? The impeachment, the coming elections, the polarization, the populism. There's a lot happening. How do you see the elections coming up? Can you see a Democrat competing with President Trump, or we will have another 4 years of President Trump?
Well, as you know, our system of elections is very complex. And before we even get to a national election campaign, the party that's out of power, in this case, the Democrats, are going through a series of primaries to establish their candidate. And we have, I think we still have about 20 or 21 people who are vying for the nomination as the Democratic nominee. And it becomes a full-time job for almost 2 years, where this collection of individuals, some politicians, some business people, some from other professions, will move from state to state in order to try to win the votes within that state that would give them enough to secure the nomination when the Democrats go to their national convention sometime next summer. So we're going to see a long period now, or in the middle of a long period, of this contest just to get to the starting point of the national election. And it's therefore very hard, as Frank said, not just to predict the outcome of the national election, but even to predict who are going to be the candidates.
Can you see any of them?
One can imagine that Donald Trump will be the Republican candidate, although at least 3 Republicans have announced until now they're considering running against him in primaries. I doubt that they're going to follow through, but it tells you that there is some ferment, even within the Republican Party, of those who think that Trump has been leading the party in the wrong direction. Of the 20 or so Democrats, Joe Biden, former senior senator from Delaware, very well known to all of us who worked in the Middle East and elsewhere, given his chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, seems to have the lead, but it is not yet a definitive lead. And there are challengers, particularly from the left, Elizabeth Warren, the senator from New Hampshire, from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. There are others who are trying to seize the center, believing that too strong a move to the progressive side of the Democratic Party would not be helpful. So that also has to sort itself out. And you have 2 phenomena at work. One is personality, and the other is policy. The party may end up choosing a candidate who is relatively centrist, but the effort by those who don't win the candidacy, especially in the progressive side of the party, will almost guarantee that the Democratic Party will go through a kind of paroxysm of debate about what it is and what they should be and what they should be against. All of this is to tell you that once you get to the national campaign, you can't just count the number of people who vote. In the last election, Hillary Clinton secured more votes than Donald Trump. Our system, however, is election by states. We have an electoral college, and you therefore have to calculate your campaign to win the right number of electoral votes from the states that will give you the margin of victory that you need. And so Trump ended up winning the presidency, having failed to secure the majority vote within the population. And that becomes an entirely different calculation, which will inform the national debate and contest.
Very complicated. I remember that. To the region. You are talking about America that's pulling out. Nearly pulling out from everywhere in the region, pulling out of Syria, pulling out of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, pulling out. What does Washington want from the Middle East. Is the Middle East still interesting to Washington? Is it still a focal point? Or are we just talking about allies? What does Washington want from the Middle East?
Well, that's a fair question, but I'm going to start by disagreeing with the premise.
Okay.
I do not believe that the United States is pulling out of the Middle East. That said, there is a deep reflection on what our interests are and what the limits of those interests are. Do we need to be operating on the assumptions that undergirded American foreign policy 20 years ago? Or do we have different compulsions? Reflect on it for a moment. We came into the Middle East full-time, faced with the former Soviet Union. That was an existential threat. That threat no longer exists. We came in a world in which hydrocarbons were of vital significance to the American economy. We're now faced with unconventional shale oil producing a change in the hydrocarbons market and therefore in the global economy. We came into the Middle East in the early days when it wasn't at all certain the future and fate of the State of Israel. Those assumptions are yesterday's assumptions. Today we have to look at a fresh way Americans define our interests. What need we do to preserve our position and adopt the sorts of policies that are necessary to protect it. So let me think for a moment with you. I think today there is very little doubt in my mind the administration wants to define itself in this region by not leaving it, but by heavying up its double downing on its policies towards the State of Israel. It also wants to make very clear that it is committed to checking what it sees as the predatory instincts of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It wants to strengthen our ties with the Gulf. It wants to preserve our ties with Egypt. None of that is leaving the Middle East. But what is clear we are trying to leave is an attempt to carry out our policies solely with the use of force. Therefore, a contraction of the American military footprint in the region in general, in Syria in particular, and a rejection or a hesitance about becoming involved in disputes in the region which are not of direct national interest. Syria could hardly be considered by most Americans as a direct threat to American national security. Certainly not Yemen, probably not Libya. As a result, you will see a lighter American footprint in those particular areas. But let me assure you that the idea that we are going to pick up our marbles and go home is very, very different way I see it. It means a lot to Egypt. Egypt will watch changes in the American engagement in the region and draw its own conclusions. I believe that seeing the United States adjusting its position in the region, Egypt will adjust its position in the region. Egypt will seek strategic autonomy, and we in Egypt will have to figure out how we're going to manage relationships where Egypt has many friends, not just as reliant on the United States as it was in the past. So there are consequences to even the adjustments that I've described, but pulling out, we're not there, and we're not pulling out of our long-standing cooperative ties with Egypt.
So Ambassador Kurtzer, Ambassador Wisner called it adjusting positions in the region. Do you agree that it's just adjusting positions? And why does this adjustment look very different than the positions during the Obama presidency, for instance? There are lots of differences between the two presidencies. Is it just adjustments or pulling out?
Yes and yes.
Yes for what and yes for
Look,
what?
one can always expect when there's a change of party and change of administration that there'll also be a change in policy and approach. And it's not unusual for a successor administration to take a look at what its predecessors has done,
And do the opposite?
and try to do the opposite, believing that what the predecessor did was wrong. You had that phenomenon back in, for example, in 2001, when we called it ABC. It was anything but Clinton when the George W. Bush administration came in. And then when the Obama administration came in, it was ABB, anything but Bush. So we've had this phenomenon before, and in that respect, it's not unusual for a new administration to reject conceptually what it has inherited. I think what Ambassador Wisner was trying to emphasize, however, is that there are certain elements of continuity in U.S. interests which administrations come around to understand, even if their initial inclinations are to change things dramatically. And we saw an example of this, and unfortunately it had horrible immediate consequences when President Trump tweeted that we were going to pull out of northeastern Syria. And it seemed to be an invitation to Turkey to come in and do its business with the Kurds. Well, we're not out of northeastern Syria. In fact, there are reports that we're continuing to rotate our troops through that area, which suggests that the inclination to do something different, which promoted the tweet, was then reversed when the president understood that maybe it wasn't such a good idea, suggesting that the continuity of interests ended up prevailing over this idea of immediate change. It is very disconcerting, I think, to those who try to see logic and continuity in our policy. It's disconcerting also for those who are carrying out the policy, because on the one hand, you wake up in the morning assuming that you're promoting policies A, B, and C, and then you read the overnight tweets, and you've got
the opposite.
You got to do an acrobatic flip and do the opposite, at least until the next day when there's a different tweet.
I have to ask you this. As a diplomat, had you been working as a current diplomat, if you are living this change of mind all of a sudden, what would you do?
You know, I love being in retirement now because I don't have to answer that question.
So you wake up in the morning
sympathize
and you
with
find the tweet completely opposite.
No, I sympathize with Ambassador Cohen and his, his colleagues because there is a degree of uncertainty which we really have never faced before. There's always change of policy, but normally the policy process gets played out sometimes logically, sometimes not so logically, but you kind of know something is brewing, especially if you're an ambassador in an important post like Egypt or like Israel where I served. You're a part of that debate, and you understand that there's some ideas that may be out there, and then the president will ultimately decide. But I never experienced, and I would imagine how hard it is to experience a situation where these changes catch you by surprise, and then you don't even know if they're firm changes or whether they're just what the last thing that the president saw on Fox News was then tweeted as an expression of policy.
Let me come in for a second to try to add a dimension to what Dan has just said. A couple of weeks ago, I found myself at dinner with Henry Kissinger. And as he sat back and looked at the several of us around him, he said, you know, if you look at the United States, you have to admit we do strategy very badly. And there's a reason for it. We come from a land that's far away from the center of action on the global stage. We've always been richly endowed with resources. Henry Kissinger went on to say, and with that then so protected and endowed, Americans didn't have to have strategies. They reacted. They reacted to events or to political pressures. But in the world of today, we need strategies, and we're not good at developing them. And because we're not good at developing them, you're looking for American strategy where we are struggling to define strategy. I personally think that the changing nature of the world order, the fact that there are no hegemonic powers, the United States is certainly not a hegemonic power, that there is a balance between the United States, China, Russia, Europeans, Japanese, in the region, Iran, Egypt, that there is an emerging balance of power. And in that situation, your wits have to be about you, strategy has to be the hallmark of your actions, because you can't solve problems militarily, you have to solve them diplomatically and politically to define it, leaving military options for later in the day.
So if we are talking about strategy, what is the American strategy towards Iran? I can see that the strategy, from my point of view is economic sanctions and tweets. So what else? How can Washington really help its allies? Iran is interfering in each and every country in the region. Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, hitting on Saudi Arabia. Is there a strategy towards Iran apart from the tweets?
I'm going to argue there is a strategy, but I'm also going to argue it's not working. The situation that you described is one that would be accurately a description of how the administration has described the problem with Iran. But at the same time, a fair look at the problem says to each of us, this region includes Iran, that you cannot come out of the difficulties without finding some balance between the interests of Iran and the interests of the other nations of the region. Iranian interference is an expression of excess and has to be contained. So today, you're seeing an American policy that Trump brought to the table that moved away from where Obama attempted by creating an international coalition around the nuclear issue and imposed massive sanctions, massive pressure. The Iranians have responded with maximum resistance. And that resistance is taking the form of limpet mines and attacks on drones, the assault on the Saudi oil production facilities, all designed to tell the United States and the rest of the region Iran can deter military action. It has the capability to deter. At the same time, if Iran is subjected to continual pressure, then Iran is certainly going to escalate on its side. So you will see more escalation. And that leaves us all, frankly, in an enormously dangerous position. Possibility that either through intended or unintended actions, there could be an explosion anywhere from Syria all the way through the Gulf. So what do you do about it? For there is, I'm sorry to go on a bit, but there is a way out, and there are the beginnings of discussions in the Gulf between Gulf states and Iran about some sort of arrangement, a Helsinki-type outcome. Macron is working on an idea of a ceasefire with Iran. Trump has offered to change American policy and jump in with a meeting with the president of Iran. All of these means that the system is moving towards some kind of engagement out of which you can rebalance the factors at play in the equation. But we are in a very dangerous, dangerous moment that could not only further disrupt this region, but have an enormous impact on the global economy.
Ambassador Kurtzer, do you think that this strategy on Iran is working?
I want to, before saying yes or no, I want to add a little texture to what I think Frank was saying, which is exactly right. The issue that we're facing with Iran, but I would also expand it to trade with China, to, we'll talk about the peace process in a few minutes,
Yes.
is the idea that there's an approach that the administration seems to want to follow, and then it almost does the opposite of trying to get to where it wants to get to. So, for example, with Iran, President Trump made clear throughout the campaign and during the first year and change of his administration that he was extraordinarily unhappy with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran Nuclear Accord. He called it the worst accord ever negotiated. It was exaggerated, but it was clear that he was going to find a way to get out of the JCPOA. And those who try to explain the president's position said that there were too many exits from that agreement which would allow Iran ultimately to fabricate a nuclear device. And there was also missing from the JCPOA any reference to Iran's malign activities in the region, as you noted, Syria, Yemen, whatever else, as well as Iran's missile development. And so even those who supported the JCPOA could not disagree with the president that it needed fixing. The problem, however, and this was the texture that needs to be added, is that by pulling out of the JCPOA, the president also pulled out of the multilateral engagement which had brought about the JCPOA. And we lost the 5 allies with whom we had been working, 4 other members of the UN Security Council and Germany, whose unity was critical in bringing about the JCPOA. Now, a more normal strategy and policy process would have said the following: I don't like the JCPOA because of all these reasons. I want to both amend it and I want to include in it those issues which were missing. So I want to then engage with my allies first, come up with a game plan of how to do this with the Iranians. It would be a combination of pressures and inducements. It's called coercive diplomacy, but it also includes inducements in terms of what Iran gets out of an amendment to the JCPOA. And you use the strength of that multilateral engagement to achieve what you want to achieve. The president pulls out of the JCPOA, loses the multilateral strength, and now we are not only facing Iran alone, but we have the five other partners, the JCPOA, at odds with us. And this is a pattern we've seen elsewhere. One other example, if I might. Trade with China. There are few people who would argue that adjustments needed to be made in U.S. trading relations with China. Their trade practices, protectionism, many of which were antithetical to their obligations under the World Trade Organization, their lack of adherence to intellectual property protection, in other words, stealing the intellectual property of companies, not just in the United States but elsewhere. Something needed to be done. This was something that a lot of people agreed with, and the Trump administration, President Trump said he was going to do something about it. What does he do? He walks into office, finds on his desk a Trans-Pacific Partnership, a multilateral agreement that we had with 12 or 13 Asian countries that would have given us tremendous leverage in dealing with the trade issues with China, and he pulls out of the TPP. So we now lose the leverage. China steps into that void. They were very quick to come not only to Asian countries, which would have been part of TPP, but also countries on the west coast of South America who were part of TPP. And they established bilateral relationships which insulated them to some degree from what the president was trying to accomplish. So it's not the absence of a strategy. You can agree with the strategy or the objective. It's this idea that they don't know what they're doing. And they
Or maybe that I can do whatever I want to do.
Well, they end up shooting themselves in their foot because they have this sense that they have to be tough without understanding that the way to achieve the objective may be through an avenue that's not just sanctions and not just punitive.
Moving to the peace process, there is a notion, there is a consensus or maybe a concept that peace process is over. There's no peace process. The U.S., Washington is not a broker anymore because it has clearly taken sides. There is nothing left to negotiate. The settlements, Jerusalem, the refugees, this is all over. What is left to negotiate about? What is left for the Palestinians to fight for? It looks like an ending story.
So I smiled, Lamise, only because if the peace process is over, I can finally go home. I've been doing this for 45 years as a policy person and academic. I've written books with the objective of trying to find a way where the United States can be helpful in advancing the prospects of a peace settlement. Frankly, we've had some progress. The fact that the foundation, the basis of what we call the peace process, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, has withstood a lot of pressures and a lot of problems and a lot of setbacks over the years, but is still a fundamental policy interest of Israel and Egypt. The fact that the Jordan-Israel peace treaty since 1994, facing setbacks, especially today, but nonetheless remains a foundation stone, tells you that this is not, we haven't lost all hope. I think if one only looks at what this administration has been doing, one can end up with the very pessimistic evaluation that informed your question. Because this is another case, as with TPP in China, as with JCPOA, where the President of the United States comes into office and says, I can make this deal. You remember on his first day after the election, he wasn't even in office, he gave an interview in the Wall Street Journal, and he said, I am the ultimate deal maker, and I can do this. It'll be the ultimate peace deal. But what do they do after he announces he's going to make the peace deal? He sides or positions American policy so much in favor of Israeli positions that he effectively has pushed the Palestinians out of the picture. Now, you can move the American embassy to Jerusalem. Congress had demanded this back in the 1990s. But you could also have done so in a way that said to the Palestinians, you can also get an American embassy in Jerusalem as soon as we have a peace agreement and there's a capital. But the president didn't do that. He moved the American embassy and he said to the Palestinians, Jerusalem is now off the table. You can demand reforms from the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees, UNRWA, UNRWA. It's not a perfect institutional structure, and it's one that has required reforms. But you don't simply cut off aid, which has the effect of hurting the humanitarian interests of the Palestinian people. You can support Israel's legitimate security requirements without supporting Israel's activities in territories that it occupied in 1967 and are the very basis of what we're supposed to be doing in the peace process. So recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights makes no sense. Israel, in fact, technically never annexed the Golan Heights. They extended law administration jurisdiction, but there was not a formal act of the Knesset that annexed the territory. The United States has now, in a sense, jumped over Israel and done more than the Israeli government has ever done. Recognizing Israel's legitimate right to build settlements undermines the very idea that at some point there will be a trade-off of territory for peace, that a Palestinian state will be able to sit side by side with Israel in peace and security, but it would be more challenging if the United States recognizes Israel's right to continue building settlements. So an administration that says it wants to make peace, and a president who thinks he can make the ultimate deal, and then step by step by step by step undermines the very fabric of that policy, it's incomprehensible. I don't think, Lamise, bottom line, that the peace process is dead. Because you have
After all what you've said?
Because you have a Palestinian people who will not lie down or roll over and play dead.
Yes, but that...
They demand self-determination. They demand an independent state. At some point, you hope that the leadership on both sides and a leadership in the United States emerge that says, okay, the playing field is tougher now. It's tougher because of settlements, it's tougher because of terrorism, it's tougher because of occupation practices, it's tougher for a lot of reasons, but that a leadership emerges that can say, we're going to grab hold of this and we're going to change the status quo for the better and move toward a two-state outcome.
But that leaves only violence to the Palestinians. That leaves nothing but violence. You're taking away, or the American foreign policy is taking away all the tools of negotiation. There is nothing to negotiate about. There are no settlements, nothing. You are just pushing them to the violent end, which no one wanted to push them to that.
If you're asking if I agree with that statement or not, I'm in violent agreement with you. I think what you've just said is a description of what is the outcome of a failure to negotiate. But I equally come back to what Dan's pointing to, is that the fact of violence is inevitably going to force the parties, including those of us on the outside, to return and re-engage in a search for a political outcome. You can't sit still. The Palestinians will not allow the situation to sit still. So whether it's today or tomorrow, whether it's Trump or post-Trump, there will be a negotiation. There is no other logical outcome.
What about the new plan instead for land for peace, which we have been negotiating for decades? We're talking now about jobs for peace. What about that? Is it viable?
Well, it's not going to work. I think the joke of the Bahrain conference was the fact that the Palestinians weren't even invited and had no role in it. And it was a plan that I normally don't tweet, but I took the occasion to tweet that if this was one of my undergraduate students, maybe I'd give it a C-. It was a very poor economic plan for a government to put forward to try to advance the prospects of an economic peace. My graduate students would have failed had they put that paper forward, and governments had no business doing it. So, you know, in a sense, I think we can take these 4 years of this Trump administration and say, there's setbacks, we've lost a lot of ground, things on the ground have gotten worse. A conflict that was hard to resolve 3 years ago is now a bit harder to resolve. But to jump from that to the idea that somehow it's now impossible and we throw up our hands and say it's finished, basically says to both the Palestinians and to those Israelis who do want an end of this conflict on an honorable and just outcome, it leaves them hanging. And frankly, I'm not prepared to subscribe to that.
Well, that's very optimistic.
Oh, thank you.
Yesterday, maybe also the young people who said, who made their voices heard at the campus, at the new campus, maybe they also emphasize the point that the peace process is not dead, and maybe it emphasizes as well that the Palestinian issue is not dead. There is always a notion that is going on these days that the younger generation that has not lived the wars, the younger generation that does not know the meaning of conflict, real conflict with Israel, doesn't care about Palestine, and I mean in the Arab world. But within each and every young person within the Arab world, still Palestine is an issue, and is a major issue, and will always live like an issue. So this is a statement, that's not a question. I will move to Egypt quickly, and then there are lots of questions. I can't read most of them, but anyway. With the very strategic relations between Egypt and the United States, there always remains the question, why didn't the United States designate the Muslim Brotherhoods as a terrorist organization till this moment?
Well, That's an important question, and it's on your mind, but let me see if I can take a step back, because I think the context is important. The way I tried to advance an argument earlier on is that we're all dealing with a new situation, and we are talking about how to adjust a relationship between the United States and Egypt, and we're trying to figure out now, under present circumstances, where that relationship will go. What should be its component parts? What prospects do we have of making this a relationship as useful to both parties as it was in the many years that followed our engagement with Egypt after the 1973 war, Camp David, and the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement? So I think that's the central question of the U.S.-Egypt relationship. Where do we go next? And there's plenty of people who throw their hands up and say it isn't going to go very far, very fast. We aren't useful as we used to be to one another. I think that's a serious mistake. I believe that there is a storehouse of value we've put together over the years of experience between the United States and Egypt that makes a big difference. It doesn't mean we've resolved all our misunderstandings or disagreements, but we've managed a relationship that helped deal with the crisis in the Gulf when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, has dealt with the Egyptian-Israeli, the Israeli-Palestinian problems over the course of many years, has dealt with Egypt's own necessity of its economic growth, its technological development. We've done a lot of things together. And so I think that the most important way to proceed is to think about what are the challenges we both face today. How can we define those and set strategies that will make it possible for us to pursue them? And those, I would like to suggest, is adapting both countries to a newly evolving world order, to the imperatives of climate change, to the need for a vibrant global economy that has trade, not aid, as the way to advance a nation's prospects. And all of these objectives need to be the underpinnings of a dialogue between Washington and Cairo. Now, that dialogue must rest on two principles. First principle that is most important is that each of us have different views of the world. You have your own domestic order, which springs from your history and your culture, and we have our domestic order that springs from our history and our culture. We will proceed successfully if we act on the basis of respect. Respect for you and your history, and you, us and our values. It means we have to overcome differences. And we have had a difference over the issue of the Muslim Brothers. There are a variety of reasons why a designation of the Muslim Brothers has not been taken by the United States, but the heart of it is that we are well beyond a point where that is a roadblock. If we want this relationship to move forward, we can agree that opposing terror, of the alignments of the United States and Egypt against extremism in its many forms are absolutely essential, and that's the right way forward. That will carry us into effective strategies and policies in situations like Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and ways to help deal with crises in the region. And that, on the basis of mutual respect and understanding, I think Egypt and the United States can continue to make a difference.
I'd like to bring this down to the ground level as well. Sitting in the back of the hall is our friend, His Excellency Amr Moussa, the former foreign minister, the Secretary General of the Arab League, who frankly knocked heads with generations of American ambassadors, including me. I still have some wounds from that period. But that part of diplomacy was very often successful because we argued issues out. Sometimes it was not successful, we disagreed. very often working together, we found ways of actually advancing issues, whether it was on the international coalition that pushed Iraq out of Kuwait or getting to the Madrid Peace Conference. That's kind of the part of diplomacy that is normally most unknown to people. But if you ask me, and I think the same would be with Frank Wisner or Frank Ricciardoni, and I know the same will be with Ambassador Cohen, what do we remember of our time in building this relationship? It's providing a microloan to a group of women in a very poor neighborhood in Cairo who used the $5,000 loan to buy equipment and were able to then employ 6 or 7 additional women doing whatever they were doing, laundry and cleaning and so forth, or providing a number of computers and a student from Cairo University to go to a town outside of Cairo that had been electrified and was introducing computer familiarity to students, and found that the instructor was overwhelmed by the demand. Or working with a coalition of Egyptian government agencies and the international community to try to help deal with the intrusion of water into the incredible monuments in Luxor, which were in prospect of actually falling down at some point because of water. And you go through this long list of seemingly small things that make up the bilateral relationship. Yes, the United States was very proud to be a partner with Egypt in helping Egypt restore much of its infrastructure, water and wastewater and electricity. We're proud of what we've done to work interoperability between the United States and Egyptian military, and we still do. That's the big stuff of diplomacy. But when you talk about the stuff that really matters, the glue, it's this people-to-people idea that has kept this relationship vital for more than 40 years. And frankly, in a relationship between a global power and a regional power, it is extremely hard to keep relationships going that long, because interests change, priorities change, policies change, and yet here we are. We are still very good friends. Ambassador Cohen, I'm sure, is going to be arguing with the foreign minister about a number of issues, but we'll also find a lot of ways to strengthen and continue to build the overall relationship and keep it going for another number of decades. That's really what keeps us all motivated.
I have a lot of questions, but my last question, do you think that strategic relation between Egypt and the United States would continue being that strategic and that strong and that close if you have a democratic president?
100%. I think in an issue of, or an era of partisanship that I talked about earlier, there are still some pillars of bipartisanship, and one of them is the importance of Egypt to the United States, and we will hope that Egypt will continue to see the importance of the United States to Egypt. It may lead to some changes. There may be tonality that's different or texture, but I don't see any possibility in the foreseeable future of a significant change.
Let me just add a quick thought to Dan's remark. The relationship will continue if we understand one another. And what we're doing today in Cairo, what Ambassador Cohen will be doing with his mission and many others, is to try to bring to you the American point of view. But I'm going to make a very strong appeal, and that is we need to hear more about Egypt in the United States. We do not have the flow of voices that I remember from my day, where you had robust congressional delegations coming and streams of ministers and public figures from Egypt explaining Egypt's perspectives, points of view, interests, needs. That we could really use a boost, because things are happening here that are promising. Your economic figures, for example, are promising.
Yes.
And these are subjects that are relatively unknown. And otherwise, if you don't do that, then the ground is occupied by those who will focus on a single issue, treatment of the press or human rights, without giving any context or understanding to what you see as Egyptians are the matters at stake.
I will start taking some questions, but if Mr. Amro Musa would have a word to comment on the discussion, I can. As a journalist, I cannot just see you there and not ask you to comment, please.
Thank you, Lamis. Thank you very much. I must start by welcoming you. We missed you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And
Thank
good
you.
luck to you. At the same time, I thank my friends, the two former ambassadors to Egypt. In fact, three, because Frank Ricciardoni is also former ambassador to Egypt. Glad to be here, and thank you, Frank, for inviting me, and congratulations, Ambassador Cohen, again. There are so many things to be said, but I will concentrate on 2 or 3 points. Number one, the relations between Egypt and the United States. We all believe, I'm one of them, that this is a relationship that has to stay. We have to deal with it with extreme care, but at the same time, there are certain points that we have to put on the table and discuss frankly. But the relationship has to stay, and I believe the United States of America, as the leading power in the world, has a lot to do in this region, and in particular in the bilateral relationship between US and Egypt. The American aid was instrumental in helping the Egyptian economy on so many fronts, as Dan explained, so many projects, etc., have been done. That is number one. Strong relationship is needed. Number two is about the region. The region is not in a good shape. America was here all the way, all the time, and there is certain responsibility on America and its policy in the region, vis-à-vis Iraq, vis-à-vis Palestine, vis-à-vis Syria, vis-à-vis even Libya. There are so many issues that make it necessary for the US to stay in the region, but play a role, an objective role, in order to help the region get out of the situation where we are today. The regional policy, there are some who say today that let us forget about Palestine and see what else can we do. We cannot forget about Palestine, because it is an issue that has to do with the national security of Egypt and the regional security. Therefore, the issue of Palestine will continue to be with us for so many years to come. The Palestinian question is not going to fade away. Dan said that the peace process is there. It will be resumed under certain conditions. The issue is not, Dan, is not the peace process, but the leadership of the peace process. The peace process cannot really convene or reconvene without the participation and leadership of the United States. But the United States policy, as presently constituted, cannot lead, because you can't lead negotiations between two countries or entities while you have helped one of them tremendously and decisively on issues of extreme sensitivity and importance for that peace process to succeed. Therefore, this is the issue. We need the peace process, but would the United States be in a position to lead that peace process under the present circumstances and after what happened, Jerusalem, settlements, Golan, etc.? This is the question. Yes, indeed, some violence will take place, as expected, as Frank said. But when would the US really play or be able to play a role, a decisive role in saying, stop it, I have ideas, Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel, but also East Jerusalem will be the capital of Palestine, and the city will be one. Can the US say so? That's number one. Number two, settlements. We understand that the settlements, we all agree that the settlements are a serious violation of international law, but that is not the point. It is serious impediment to any agreement, any deal, because where would the Palestinians establish their state? So what is the idea in the US? Would this صفقة القرن اسمها إيه, deal of the century tackle this point? So the issue is in Washington. Are you ready? Not you, of course. Would President Trump be ready to change policy, change course, and said, okay, when I recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, I did not prevent the idea that East Jerusalem would be the capital of Palestine if both parties agree that the city will not be divided, and so on. There are a lot of constructive ideas, but we were blocked by the recent actions and policies. I know your position, and I value very much you, Dan, your role in the peace process, and Frank understands Egypt very well and knows what should be done and how Egypt would be convinced that now is the moment that we have to play a role. When we think, sit down and think, so this is not the moment. What would we do? Therefore, that moment has to be reached, that now Egypt has to intervene. I see that we all in the Middle East, of course, you are busy with so many things, but this does not mean that the Palestinian question is off the priority list. After all, thank you very much indeed for this wonderful interview, and more of this would be very important. I last month I was in China, and the president met us, a certain group of former officials. She said one thing: I want you to understand China. I want you to understand China. Now we have to tell you, and you have to tell Washington and the White House, we have to understand Washington. Where does Washington stand? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Amr Moussa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ambassador Dani, would you like to comment?
No, thank you. I agree. This is one of those cases where we didn't have to knock heads. We actually agree with each other. For sure, Palestine cannot be taken off the table. For sure, advancing the prospects of peace is going to require a different approach in Washington. I suspect that we won't see a different approach over the next year, as long as this administration is in office. But I would be very happy to be surprised by a change of mood and a change of mind. There's a lot of work to be done just to reverse the
damage.
And then after it's reversed, to then start building towards a resolution of the conflict. And that's the part we need to look forward to, so we work together on that.
So quickly, I have so many questions, but I will take a few. What advice would you give the new ambassador, Ambassador Cohen? What advice would you give him? That's from Parliament member Ibrahim Hijazi. And what about the role of the United States in the issue of the Ethiopian dam, considering the good relations between President Trump and President Sisi?
Right. First of all, let me thank you for that question, because it gives me an opportunity to tell all of you how delighted those of us who are part of the American diplomatic tradition are with Jonathan Cohen's assignment here to Egypt. He is a brilliant diplomat, and all of us wish him well, and he is doesn't need any advice. He will learn what we, all three of us, learned, and that is that it is just enormously exciting to be in Egypt. It's a pleasure to be here, and the joy of being here will give you a lot of guidance on where you want to go. So I'm not going to give Ambassador Cohen, who knows what his instructions are, and he knows what his interests are. As to the question of the
Ethiopian
Egyptian talks about the Nile and the dam, I think the United States is playing the kind of role I like to see it play, which is not a role of interposing itself and taking the place of either of the two parties, but facilitating talks, helping people get together, providing ideas and backup, providing technical thoughts. The final analysis, this has got to be an agreement between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. No outside power can define that agreement, but outsiders like ourselves can help provide a forum in which the agreement is reached. And so I think we're on the right track.
Many questions on the arms deal between Egypt and Russia, and one of those says, how does the threatening with sanctions by the U.S. Because of the arms deal with Russia fit with the picture?
I would prefer not to start with threatening sanctions, but to talk about what the implications might be. The United States and Egypt have had this exceedingly strong relationship, but Egypt is also an independent country, and it's going to have what I borrow the term from Frank Wisner, strategic autonomy in deciding from where it needs to acquire weapons and with whom it's going to partner in its future activities. In doing so, however, I think both the United States and Egypt need to bear in mind what the implications are of that kind of an arms deal, where you might have a situation where the arms delivered by another country, perhaps Russia, end up on a base where American arms are located. There may be Americans on that base who are helping Egypt maintain and train, and the question is, can that continue when, for example, Russian technicians would be present as well? There are a myriad number of problems in the diversification of arms acquisition, not the least of which is the interoperability question. One of the reasons why Egypt, when it took the decision to join the coalition in 1990-91 to reverse Iraq's aggression against Kuwait, why that decision was so meaningful is because Egyptian arms doctrine and training was essentially interoperable with American arms doctrine and training. And so the two Egyptian divisions that went to the front alongside American and other allied forces, we weren't talking apples and oranges. We were able to talk to each other, and the equipment was able to relate to each other, and we were able to plan military moves together. Not so simple when you introduce a major arms system from whatever country, in this case Russia. So I would rather have a discussion about that before we get into threats and sanctions and all that. That's the possibility of what happens if is so far down the line. We first need to have very, very significant discussions, which frankly we normally do have. There is an ongoing structure for military-to-military talks, and my guess is, I'm a civilian now, I don't know this, but my guess is that we are in the midst of very intensive discussions about some of the issues that I just mentioned.
Libya, there is also a question on Libya. What is the role of the United States regarding Libya?
My easy answer is I wish I knew. The United States has not, was involved heavily, obviously, in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. But since then, we have taken a general posture of trying to support a United Nations brokered settlement. That settlement has not taken effect. The United States so far has resisted the temptation of picking sides between Tripoli and General Haftar, Field Marshal Haftar. We have shown some signals of trying to put pressure on both sides to come to an agreement. We don't like the intrusion of the Russians in the Libyan equation, but don't ask me to go beyond that and tell you exactly what strategy is, because frankly, I don't think one has been defined in a very careful manner.
A lot of questions, but maybe a question about human rights. Are human rights in the region still interesting for the United States? Human rights issues?
Look, as a country, there's no question that we have had a long history of supporting, advancing the prospect of strengthening human rights throughout the world. But as I mentioned yesterday at the university, one of the great diplomats in American political tradition, George Kennan, once talked about the influence that we really could have in the world, and he didn't talk about haranguing other countries. What he talked about was strengthening American institutions so that when people looked at the United States, they would say, that's what we want to be like. We want to emulate the protection of freedoms and the liberties and so forth that they would see in the United States. We have some work to do at home, as we talked about earlier in this program. And it's probably a challenging time for the United States to try to preach about human rights. That said, it remains an important component of our thinking when we deal with other countries. It's a hard dialogue to have. It's not easy when Frank and I were ambassador here to engage on issues that were current at the time in Egypt that were of concern to the United States. Sometimes we made some progress, sometimes we did not. So it's always going to be part of our agenda. It's a difficult time to do so when the United States itself is in the midst of this change, but I don't see any major change in our effort to advance human rights practices around the world.
Mies, I would add just a small point to what Dan said, and that is I think there is an evolution in American thinking. No relaxation in our commitment to human rights and our view of the essential nature of human rights in the international system. But whether the United States should, as John Quincy Adams put it, a former president in the 1820s, do we go abroad to slay dragons? Or do we essentially look after our interests, ourselves and the nations in the world we deal with, and reflect through our values and our position where we stand on human rights? I think what you're going to see in the years ahead is less of a sense that the United States is going to take actions that force the pace of human rights as opposed to setting an example. Now, that's not always going to be true. We've just had the Congress pass a new act on Hong Kong, so there will be many demonstrations of American involvement and interest. But I think that strategic shift is important in recognizing how we're changing the direction we've taken.
I think with that answer, I want to thank Ambassador Kurtzer, Ambassador Wisner. I want to thank you all. I know that we're past our designated time. I have so many questions on Yemen, on the details of the region. I don't know, do you want me to go on? Keep going on? I think the ambassadors have to leave. So thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I was honored to moderate it, and I want to welcome you both to Cairo. Hope you can stay more and enjoy the sun. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much.